Greetings, folks, and welcome back. For this little talk, I think I'd like to finish what I started last time out with Canadian English and wrap that up with a bit of a venture into Maritime English. And when I say little talk, I really do mean that. I'll try to keep this relatively brief, as I am throwing 3 rather than 2 lectures at you this week. Let's just do a little bit of a tour of how English sounds down east. Let's just start with a few general observations. 1. Like all English-Canadian dialects, or at least all of which I'm aware, Canadian raising is present in Maritime English, although sometimes it does sound a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The Canadian shift, on the other hand, is generally absent here, as discussed last time as well, while it's more common and increasingly common in the provinces to the west of Quebec. That said, I don't mean to imply that maritime vowels are in any sense a purer form of Canadian vowel than the ones further west, because we have our own shifts and our own ways of saying things. One of them, as I think I've mentioned, is a fronting and raising of the ah vowel when it occurs before an r. So, rather than driving a car, as I would in Toronto, in Fredericton I drive a car. That is, it's a little closer to the ah than the ah, and depending on whereabouts in the region you are, that fronting can be more or less extreme. In the Fredericton area, it's not terribly extreme. Up in the Miramichi, it's much more pronounced. Similarly, the ah vowel, as in bath, cat, is raised in some environments but not in others. That is, there is a version of what's called the bath trap split going on in the Maritimes, which I'll talk to you more about when we hit Australia next time. But what that means really is simply that vowel ah is sometimes raised and sometimes not raised. And where and when that happens really depends on dialect. In the Maritimes, it's fairly common before unvoiced plosives. So, for example, rather than wearing a hat or a cap, I might wear a hat or a cap. And incidentally, just in my own informal observations, I've noticed that this pronunciation tends to be more extreme among speakers from the Miramichi on the one hand and Cape Breton on the other. But as I said, this is just an informal observation on my part. But okay, I mentioned something about Canadian raising being a little different in the Maritimes. This is what I mean. The allophones I tend to be, in some areas of the Maritimes, many actually, slightly rounded. So rather than saying, for example, hi, as one would say in General American, or in Canadian English as well, because there's no Canadian raising on that one, a Maritimer might say something like hi. Or, if we want an example with raising, there's the word kite, which in General American would be kite, and that might be pronounced something like kite in various areas around the Maritimes, particularly rural areas. Or if you prefer, we can take a look at the realization of the ow diphthong, which in raising tends to be realized as ow. So rather than house, as someone speaking General American would say, a Canadian west of Quebec is more likely to say something like house. In the Maritimes, that ow will often tend to be rounded to something like o. So rather than house or house, we get house, which to American ears may sound something like hoose. Well, what this means is that in some speech communities in the Maritimes, there is a bit of a vowel merger going on, where the diphthongs in poach and pouch, or coach and couch, drift together to the point where those words become homophones, and are liable to be pronounced something like poach and coach, respectively. This is something as well that I would be interested to see how it plays out over the next few decades. But of course, Maritime English, even if looked at only briefly, is not just about pronunciation, it's also about words. And there are some usages out here that are rather interesting. One of the first ones I noticed when I moved out here was the use of some as an intensifier. That is, as a synonym for very, for example. The weather can be some cold, or that donair can be some good. And speaking of intensifiers, another fairly common one out here is right. In fact, there are a couple of different usages of the word right, each of which is pronounced differently. So where right is used as an intensifier, it's pronounced with standard Canadian raising, or depending on the dialect area you're in, the Maritime version, the slightly rounded version of Canadian raising. That was right good, or they were right pissed. On the other hand, if it's used as an interrogative, it tends to be pronounced more like right. Right? She's cold out, right? Or even just as a follow-up, someone makes a statement. For example, it's really hard right now not being able to see your friends, to which you might reply, right? Meaning that you agree. But again, the word is raised in a different way in this usage than it is when it's used as a modifier, or rather as an intensifier. I find that rather curious. And this is the only place where I've heard it. And as I mentioned in the last talk, there is a tendency in the Maritimes to use the third-person singular feminine pronoun to refer to inanimate things. Now, this isn't exclusively a maritime usage. For example, ships have long been referred to as she's. This goes right back to the age of sail and probably before. And popular car culture has picked up that usage in North America as well, and people typically, if they name their cars, for example, give them female names, and often refer to them with the feminine pronoun as well. But in the Maritimes, this usage seems to have gone to a whole new level. She can be the weather, as in she's right cold. And it's not just the subject pronoun, but also the object pronoun that comes into use. As in, have a go at her, or that'll do her, or have at her. In all of which uses, of course, the H is dropped. Other common slang terms in Maritime English include buddy, feller, fussy, and sook. Buddy can be your buddy, but it can also just be some person you happen to be talking about. Instead of, this guy was walking down the street, so buddy was walking down the street. And a feller is generally any male person up to round about middle age or so. Getting past middle age, and he's no longer a feller, but he's more likely to be an old fella. And just as right has a couple of different meanings, so does fussy. If you are fussy, it means you're finicky, you're picky. This usage isn't exclusive to the Maritimes. I grew up with it myself, but it's very common out here. On the other hand, if you're not fussy about something, it means you're not fond of it, you don't like it. Again, not uniquely a maritime usage, but more common here than elsewhere in the country. And as for being all pouty and mopey, well then you're just sookin'. And I had never heard that term until I came out here, and that is typically a maritime usage. Another common element of Maritimes English, though of course not universal, is what I call itinerant S's. Some nouns, particularly beer, remain non-count nouns even in the plural, so you can have one beer or you can have 6 beer, not beers. On the other hand, lots of words pick up S's that don't belong there in standard English. For example, anywheres, nowheres, somewheres, or the maritime equivalent of y'all, yous, often pronounced yuz. But of course, I'm not really from here. And if you want to hear an example of someone speaking maritime English in all its glory, here's one of my favorite clips of all time. And it is set right here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick. So enjoy that and see what you think. You'll notice several of the traits that I've actually mentioned over the last few slides, and probably a few other things as well. Some of which I think we'll probably be able to talk about on Friday. Also, quite frankly, many of you can probably tell me slang terms that are common in the Maritimes rather than me telling them to you, because a number of you are from here. And I would be genuinely curious to hear what you have to say about that. in order largely to shamelessly steal the information and use it again next time I teach this course, as I think I mentioned last lecture. So anyways, I'm going to leave this here, and you give it a listen, and then we'll see what you think. And for now, I think that's it. As I said at the end of the last lecture, and I think at the beginning of this one, this isn't a standalone lecture itself. It's really just the completion of the lecture on Canadian English, and wasn't intended to take up a full lecture slot, as I also will be talking to you about Australian English this week. In any case, I hope you've found the brief introduction to some of the quirks of Maritime English to be interesting. Probably a lot of it is just stuff that you recognize anyway. And as I said a minute ago, there's also probably a fair bit that you folks can tell me. So for now, I think I'm going to call it a day and probably get on to prepping the Australian lecture. Thanks for listening. Talk soon.